Okay, so I wanted to talk about how do we begin the process of reading Shakespeare. We begin talking a little bit about this in class, but now that we are online, we're going to have to actually talk about the process of it, as we are not going to be reading aloud in class. Now, you can watch this online and you will watch an actual Shakespearean production of Othello online, but I wanted to talk about how you, as you interact with the text, can make sure that you're prepared in reading it. Because whenever I teach Shakespeare, there's always the students that are just scared. Shakespeare brings a sense of fear to people, and as they try to understand a text, they always are afraid they're not able to understand Shakespeare. And they do this just simply because Shakespeare seems overwhelming at first, and his language is not overwhelming, and his meaning is not overwhelming. He's pretty easy to actually understand, but that doesn't mean that there aren't parts that are extremely, extremely complex and extremely difficult. Um, Scholars and professors and teachers and students all alike still have times where they struggle reading Shakespeare. So this video is going to be about how you can go about that process of sort of breaking down that fear of Shakespeare and taking on the text in a way that will appropriate itself to a beginning interpretation of the text or a beginning understanding to the text. um, so, why are people so scared to read Shakespeare? Well, the real difficulty is the fact that Shakespeare wrote his works over 400 years ago. And so you have this gap of 400 years that separates us from his writing. So our job is to minimize that gap as much as possible. So in order to do this, we're going to sort of delineate a strategy for how we can close that gap. The first thing that we're going to do is understand that strategy is going to be done through context. Context means understanding the outside effects on whatever we're studying. In the case of Othello, we want to understand the context of language, literature, history, and society. Now, because this class is not some sort of detailed English major class, we are not going to be going into extreme literary criticism. We're just going to be doing a sort of very brief uh, analysis of looking at the way we interpret and understand Shakespeare. So by language, what we mean is considering the vocabulary, the style, the syntax, and the rhetorical devices that Shakespeare uses. By literature, we're talking about the structural framework of the language that he uses. For example, it's important to know that Othello is a play, and so we're going to be expecting dialogue. We're going to be expecting different sort of a different sort of structural than a novel would have, right? And you also need to know that Othello is a tragedy. That tells us a lot more about what we should be expecting out of this play. We also need to know about Shakespeare's history, what was happening in the world when Shakespeare wrote Othello, who was the king, who was the queen, what geographically was happening. It's really important to understand, and if you were to read something like Macbeth, um, why Shakespeare was writing Macbeth. And of course, that's partly because you have this huge change in the monarchy going from Elizabeth to King James, and King James being the king of both Scotland and England at the time. And so Shakespeare sort of homages this play Macbeth to King James. And there's lots of issues about kingship in there and who should be king and things like that. So it really fits the time period that Shakespeare wrote it. And then, of course, society simply follows the history by asking what were people like? How did they treat each other? Remember these four key areas: language, literature, history, and society. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at each of them individually. So Shakespeare's language, this is our first tool. Why are students so scared of Shakespeare? Well, they often respond to me because he's writing in a different language. And the truth is, he's not. He's writing in modern English. And if you don't believe me, compare him to texts like Beowulf or the Canterbury Tales. I teach both of those as well, and they're much more complex. Beowulf is, of course, Old English, and you actually have to completely learn a different language to understand the Beowulf text if you're not reading a translation. And Canterbury Tales is Middle English, which is going to have a lot of different sort of spellings and word changes and things like that within them. So Shakespeare is modern English. That gap is not so far away that it's actually a different language. It's modern English. It's just in the different form. So both of them are more difficult than Shakespeare, Beowulf and Canterbury Tales. But that doesn't mean that Shakespeare isn't difficult. But it does help knowing that he writes in modern English. So how do we do that? How do we go about then understanding these texts that seem to be just a little bit different? Well, first you need to recognize that you're going to have to know um, words. You're going to have to be willing to sit down and learn some words because Shakespeare is attributed with more than 3,000 words in the dictionaries. Most scholars think Shakespeare had a vocabulary around 25,000 words. That's twice the average college student. In fact, most English speakers have a vocabulary of around 5,000 words they use in their lives. So, how do you minimize this gap? How do you minimize this 25,000 and 5,000 words that many people do? Most college students have around, somewhere between, 9 to 10,000. Okay. So, first off, you most likely have gotten the Folger edition of Othello. That's the text that I wanted you to get simply because it's cheap as can be on Amazon. It's like $4. It's the mass market paperback. And each edition includes an edited text that's based on the best early printed version of the play, and it has a lot of explanatory notes that are just placed on the pages facing the text of the play. So as you're reading it, you can of course see that. Each page has a side page that has difficult words, idiom, sentences that are given in its modern context. This alone minimizes the gap greatly. Other editions have modern language on one side of the page and the original on the other. We don't recommend that because we want the students typically to focus on the original text and what the original text is doing. But modern language isn't an all bad sort of situation either. So we also want to use the context of language. For example, here are two lines from the Hamlet text. He was a man, take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again. My lord, I think I saw him yesternight. So modern English doesn't use words like in this way anymore, and it doesn't use yesternight at all. But if you look at the lines and perhaps a few lines before and after, it's easy to understand that like means their likeness or their face, and yesternight is, of course, last night. These aren't difficult things to understand. So it's just taking a little bit of ingenuity to say, hey, there's the context and there's what fits. Also, remember Shakespeare often uses contractions. He shortens words and sentences frequently throughout his play. Look at the context to understand the meaning of these contractions, and these are the most common characteristics that contractions that Shakespeare uses. These are ones that he will use over and over and over in all of his plays. So I highly recommend that you actually just learn to memorize these. They're not hard; they're very easy to know and to learn. Next is Shakespeare's syntax. Almost all English has a very specific word order to write a sentence. This is anybody that knows other languages know that other languages don't focus so much on word order. Latin typically has the verb at the end and the subject at the beginning, indirect object, then direct object, and that's sort of the way that Latin works. And sometimes it helps to know that, but that's not as focused in Latin as it is in English. Same thing with Spanish, French, all of those languages that come from a Latin origin. Simply, English has the most word order specificity. Um, the active voice is considered most appropriate in English, and that means the subject comes before the verb. The direct object often comes lingering at the end of the sentence, and so this is what we call syntax. Syntax is simply the order of parts in a sentence. Shakespeare loved to play with syntax. He loved to mess with it. And so and I think this is really the big area that people become afraid of Shakespeare is, oh, what does this mean? How does this, and because syntax is so important to us, and yet we don't use it to its full ability often the way that Shakespeare did. So let's look at the modern sentence. For example, I love ice cream. I is your subject, verb is love, and ice cream is your direct object. Now, this could be written while keeping the same meaning. I ice cream love. Love ice cream I. Love I ice cream. Ice cream I love. Ice cream love I. So you have all of these ways that are grammatically correct, but these sentences are all inverted from the modern form. Therefore, we call them inversions. Shakespeare loved using inversions because he could emphasize certain words, use the sentences in a more poetic way, and perhaps even create a speech pattern for a character by doing this. Next, Shakespeare uses consistent rhetorical devices, another word for figurative language. He loves using words in a specific way to emphasize and embellish the text. He does this to express important functions of characterization and to show mastery over the English language as well. The Shakespeare Resource Center has a great list of these rhetorical devices. It's important to study and know these. As trite as memorization and defining each sounds, it's actually a really important step to understanding Shakespeare, poetry, and language. These are going to be things like metaphor, simile, imagery, assonance, consonants, alliteration. All of these forms will help you. So go look up the Shakespeare Resource Center and just print out a list of those rhetorical devices and keep those as you are reading the text. So now that Shakespeare's language is under control, let's begin to look at the context of literature. What does literature mean? What I mean by this is what sort of genres is Shakespeare writing in? Well, Shakespeare luckily only wrote in two genres, in drama and poetry. His poetry is all in the form of sonnets, but his plays have a lot more variety. For our purposes, it's important to understand the influences on Shakespearean plays, and also especially on his tragedies, since Othello is a tragedy. So, the first influence that we have to consider is the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle, as he's sitting there in Greece watching, the first of the ancient Grecian plays, he is developing ideas of what makes a good play, and he writes this down. And so he focuses on plays, comedies, tragedies, and he begins to really sort of dissect these. And give them meaning and purpose and talk about the different elements within them. So his definition of tragedy was very important to Shakespeare and other writers of the Renaissance. Aristotle actually focuses on the dramatic structure of tragedy and suggests that there are four extremely important elements. Plot is, of course, the most important. The central character is neither wholly good nor wholly evil, and their fall results from an error in judgment. The hero eventually realizes their error and its consequences, but it's too late to change. So the audience responds with a combination of fear and pity to a story about a character who elicits their sympathy. These are the four primary things that we see in tragedy that Aristotle suggests must be present. Now, Shakespeare differs from this style in two distinct ways. First of all, many of his tragedies are psychological. Macbeth is psychological in the sense of considering what changes a man. How does evil change a man to becoming subhuman? This is a big question. Hamlet is, of course, psychological in the sense of is he insane? Is he not? Is he the most intelligent person? Is he not? These are extreme characters that are complex and pretty wonderful. In Othello, you have the same sort of thing, especially when you have this active villain in Iago who is psychologically just absolutely manipulating everybody in the play. So Shakespeare really cares about the psychological, so he emphasizes the interior activity of the mind just as much as the outward physical action of the plot. Shakespeare also adds unique and complex characters to shift some attention away from the central character. He likes having some really interesting different characters. And of course, he does this in Othello with Iago and Cassio and Desdemona, who's really a very interesting female character. Shakespeare was also influenced a lot by Seneca. He was another important writer that is worth mentioning. His Latin plays were studied in Elizabethan schools during Shakespeare's time. The elements that Elizabethan schools and Shakespeare often borrowed are the violence and sensationalism, The role of the supernatural, especially in its darker forces, and this is in so many Shakespearean tragedies. Othello is actually one that doesn't have the darker forces of the supernatural in there. There may be some people that would suggest otherwise, but you don't see it a lot. The presence of ghosts, and that's often associated with the theme of revenge. Powerful female characters like Desdemona, and a hero who's morally free to make his own choices and demonstrates introspection or thoughtful reflection, but manifests stoicism or courage and a strong will in the face of adversity. History is also extremely important to literature. When something's written, it stands as a historical document for that time period. For example, many modern dystopian novels that are about a bad future, how government's taking control, things like Brave New World or We, or even The Hunger Games, are written down at times where you have a lot of issues with government. Brave New World, We, 1984. These books were all written, after a world war. It's extremely significant because it provides answers on how people felt about war, about experiencing it, about living through it, and the harrowing effect it has on humans after it has ended. This tells us a lot about what humans are thinking about in this time period and what they've gone through, at the same time. So with Shakespeare, there's often two histories to account for: the history when Shakespeare is writing and the history of the events in which he writes. So, what's going on in Shakespeare's life when he writes it, and also what's going on in the history of the play itself. It's also important to know about the history of Shakespeare, and, for example, the history surrounding Hamlet, not the book, but the actual person, if there was one, right? Or the actual Macbeth or the actual Othello. Shakespeare often uses successful plays and historical stories to create his own plays. Many of Shakespeare's plays are actually considered histories. Othello, the Moor of Venice, is a tragedy that was written by Shakespeare, believed to be written in approximately 1603, so right before he writes Macbeth. And it's based on an Italian short story by Cinthio, and I think that's how you pronounce it. But he was a disciple of Boccaccio, who first published his writing in 1565. So you're looking at about a 50-year difference here, 40-year difference between the two. Um, and so Shakespeare does this a lot. He's going to use other sources, and I feel like he doesn't create the story, but he makes it much better. This is really what Shakespeare's pretty incredible at doing, and he makes the story way better than it ever could have been. So it's almost to the point of pure originality. Last, it's important to put Shakespeare in the context of society. Shakespeare was a part of the emerging middle class and had the rare opportunity to work directly for both Queen Elizabeth and King James. Now, during this time, Shakespeare helped finance the building of the Globe Theatre. This theater became a place of equality. The peasants and the aristocracy would be in the same place at the same time. So we need to remember that Shakespeare put subtle ideas throughout his plays that reference societal ideas in politics, behavior, religion. The Globe allowed Shakespeare's characters to become his mouthpiece. But it's also important to recognize that Shakespeare wrote his plays knowing his audience is from all classes of society. He writes often crude but humorous material for quick entertainment. The lower class audience would have often seen this sort of thing performed on streets, but he uses this material as a catalyst to force his audience to consider higher ideas and themes about humanity. Shakespeare really cared about a lot of these people, and maybe he just cared about money. Either way, if you would like to read more about Shakespeare's life, what we know of it, there's very little, and what Shakespeare might have been going through during the process of his life. There's a great book, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's by Bill Bryson, and it's a short little volume, and I highly recommend that you just go on Amazon, type in Bill Bryson and Shakespeare, and it'll pop up. I wonder if I could actually just figure it out here real quick for you. So it's Bill Bryson's Shakespeare's The World as a Stage. It's 230 pages, $13 on Amazon. It really is an incredible introduction to Shakespeare and to what life was like for Shakespeare. I highly recommend it. It's completely entertaining. If you know anything about Bill Bryson, you know that you'll completely enjoy it. So I hope that helps, and that's the end of this video. If you have any questions about it, feel free to go back, take notes, do what you need to do.